Okay. Let's try this again.
Welcome to Forking Off, the podcast by former feds who got the fork out. I'm Jill Fields.
And I'm Philip Fields.
Now, before we get started, make sure to hit the follow button.
You can find all our content and show notes on our website, forkingoff.com.
And if you enjoy what we do and want to help, consider supporting us on Ko-fi. Hi, we've got a great show today. Our guest is going to be Michael Duffin. He was a former senior policy advisor at State Department, and he's running for Congress for Virginia's 8th Congressional District for the U.S. House of Representatives. Michael's got a really interesting story of how he came to the State Department and the work that he was doing there. He was in the Bureau of Counterterrorism for 12 years and worked in the Office of Countering Violent Extremism. So he was doing a lot of cool stuff, huh, Philip?
Yeah, he was doing a lot of really cool stuff, and he's going to walk us through sort of how his office progressed over the years and all of the great things that they were doing. But he also highlights something that I think everybody needs to be aware of. As we're going into the World Cup in America 250, Michael warns we're dangerously unprepared for these events. I think we can see some of that already. The White House had actually established a task force to oversee security and preparations for the World Cup. That's not generally how you plan. Like, the president and the vice president are leading the task force for these events.
That's odd.
Yeah.
That's really, really odd. I feel like they have bigger things to do.
Or maybe are grossly unqualified.
Yeah, okay.
They've also, though, they've put this under the Department of Homeland Security, which that happens a lot with these types of events where they're the administrative oversight, but a lot of the work actually gets done elsewhere. And so far, CBP has said, they're processing millions of expedited applications from foreign visitors and guests. ICE has their Operation Red Card, which is supposedly not about immigration, but I think a lot of people have questions there. And that's where I think some of this unpreparedness starts from. It may be that they're just interested in making sure the events are secure and there's no human trafficking going on and those traditional concerns, but the extreme lack of trust between communities and local governments and the federal government right now, I don't think that we can expect people to be as open about reporting threats as normal. That's, I think, the biggest concern, because a lot of times when we think about things like the World Cup, we think about metal detectors at the gates and bomb dogs walking around and all of this stuff. And that's great. And I'm sure that will be there. What gets missed, and these are where attacks tend to happen, like in 2010 during the World Cup in Kampala, it was actually at a rugby bar where hundreds of guests were gathered to watch the event and Al-Shabaab detonated bombs. That's the kind of thing that requires trust between communities to be looking for those things, but then when they see something suspicious, to report.
And they have to trust.
Yeah.
They have to trust who they're reporting to.
And Michael will touch on that a little bit about the kind of distrust that he experienced overseas when trying to get foreign communities to be willing to come to the United States and say, hey, there's this threat that you need to be aware of. That's sort of the same theme we have here is we have foreign diplomats from all over the world coming. We've also got the Iran war going on, and IRGC is known for trying to carry out assassinations of foreign diplomats that they don't like. So we've got that we need to be worried about. AQAP has been releasing new Inspire videos about carrying out attacks in the West.
Which is so wild. It feels like we are reliving 10 years ago.
We may have regressed a little.
Just a smidge.
I'm sure we'll hear phrases like there are no credible threats.
Oh.
This is a popular one that quite literally just means we don't know one individual is actively planning to carry out an attack.
Yeah.
But it's very uncommon that we have knowledge of a credible threat before an attack takes place. When we do, we usually disrupt it. But We do have earlier this year in February, the ISIS spokesperson claimed that ISIS knows now when to remain silent, and not having a credible threat right now doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means that these groups have learned not to broadcast that kind of intent. And we've seen this quite a bit lately. We also have far-right extremists who are going to have much easier access to the kinds of targets that they normally think about when they're coming to visit their cities as opposed to in far-off places. So we've got all of these converging events that are really creating this environment that Michael is referring to with the lack of preparedness. On top of all of this, the World Cup finals are what's called a national special security event, which means the team coordinating security for that is the Secret Service. And we talked just a little bit about perimeter security. And quite frankly, Secret Service has shown over the last year that they're not doing a great job at perimeter security. I personally have a lot of concerns about that as well.
Yeah. I mean, we saw with the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and you can see in the videos how easily their perimeter was breached.
Yeah, there's a huge lax, and I think it has a lot to do with the changeover in personnel. And a lot of these agencies are short-staffed at this point, and the staffs that they have don't have the training that they used to.
Yeah. And they're not allowing the people that may have some of that training to apply to those jobs. That's actually something that Michael brings up in this interview. So why don't we go ahead and hear what Michael has to say?
All right.
All right. So today we have Michael Duffin with us. Hi, Michael. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Oh, we're so excited to have you. So why don't we go ahead and get started with your bluff, your bottom line up front?
I am a RIF State Department employee. I worked there 12 years. I was one of the people who was RIF by DOJ last July, and I worked in counterterrorism for a decade. I am now running for Congress as a Democrat in Virginia's 8th Congressional District.
That's a big flip from civil servant to running for office, but I love it. I think that is so great. What led you to go to the State Department in the first place? How did you get there and get into public service?
I was a journalism major. I was in graduate school, graduated a couple of weeks before 9/11 happened, and I really had no interest in the world around me. I covered sports. I loved music, didn't know much about politics, let alone international affairs. And so 9/11, for a lot of people who worked at the State Department, it was an eye-opener. Not just why would these 19 hijackers attack our country, but also I'm originally from Chicago. And so a few miles from my community, there were anti-Muslim protests. And so it really made me wonder why people would have this vitriol towards Muslims and immigrants in general. And so it led me on this journey, and I started traveling internationally, got familiar with other cultures. And then I wanted to know if there was a career that would allow me to learn more about the world and also contribute my skill set. And so eventually ended up at the State Department.
That is really cool. So tell us a little bit about what you did at the State Department. What was your job there?
I worked in the Office of Countering Violent Extremism in the Bureau of Counterterrorism. And so this is violent prevention, working with community stakeholders around the world, particularly in hotspots where there was a lot of recruitment by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. The office started in 2016. I had been doing that work for a year prior to then. And so just the tens of thousands of people from around the world who went to Syria and Iraq to fight for the Islamic State, we were trying to reduce support for that terrorist organization. And eventually it expanded to counter white supremacy.
Philip and I both were working in the CT space around that same time. Philip had been working there for a while. 2016 was a wild time.
It was a ride.
Yeah. So being at the State Department and dealing with the international relations around that and just like the world impact, that's so cool. But you also mentioned, besides just like Islamic State, you mentioned the white supremacy side of that. How was that outside of the United States?
There still is a symbiotic relationship between white supremacists in the United States, elements of the white supremacist movement, both in Australia, the UK, but also in Central and Eastern Europe. And so white supremacists from the United States would like to communicate with counterparts in other countries and travel to those places. And so starting from nothing, starting from scratch, we took some of the lessons from countering ISIS and Al-Qaeda and applied them to places like Slovakia and France, and develop some new programming to address it, because it was in some cases apples to oranges, as I would like to say. And so we started to build up partnerships, and it was about creating awareness about the threat And then what are the programs or what are the types of engagements that could be used that could steer people away from mobilizing to violence?
Yeah, and you mentioned similarities between the white supremacy groups and the threats that we had been facing. It was interesting to me, with groups like the Base, how much they actually drew directly from sort of themselves the lessons that had been learned out of fighting ISIS and Al Qaeda for many years before. That, I think, was totally unexpected for me.
Yeah, and the challenge that we faced was, white supremacists and Islamist terrorists were in a lot of cases quite different. And so ISIS or Al Qaeda, when they would inspire an attack, their followers would want to kill dozens, if not hundreds of people. White supremacists, there are some examples of people who tried to perpetrate and, successfully in the case of the Christchurch attack in 2019, he killed 51 people. But in many cases, they're trying to kill one prominent individual within a community, whether that's a politician or a religious figure or attacking a minority community, an immigrant community.
That's really impactful work. Tell us about your departure at State Department. I normally ask, why did you leave public service? But you told us you were riffed. So tell us more about that.
I was a committed public servant, nonpartisan, even though considered myself a liberal even before running as a Democratic candidate. As I like to tell people, when I walked through those doors at the State Department, I checked my political beliefs at the door, and I didn't want to engage in political banter with colleagues, even at the so-called water cooler. And so there were rumors about a reorganization at the State Department, but we thought because we worked in the Bureau of Counterterrorism that we would not be impacted by it. And so I was, when I say in denial about what was discussed in the press about possible rifts. And then in April of last year, we had a 15-minute meeting scheduled with the number 2 person in our bureau. And the meeting was titled Update on the Reorganization. It didn't say you're going to get riffed and we're going to talk about this. I was not suspecting this bad news. And so it was a shock, not just to me, but to my coworkers who put blood, sweat, and tears into standing up this office, this coalition over roughly a decade. And then not just that the work would end, but our careers would end. And I didn't know that at the time. And certainly there's the potential to go back to government service later. But at this point, roughly a year later, it's apparent that they don't want us returning to the government. And this wasn't merely an act of bureaucratic musical chairs where our office is eliminated and we're reassigned. It was more blacklisting where there are so many barriers for us to rejoin the federal government.
We've seen that with other people that we've talked to, other former feds who have tried to get back in with the government, who've applied with jobs, and they are not being considered. It's sad, especially because, like you said, you were a dedicated public servant. You were there for the good of the country and the people. And I don't want to say we were thrown away, but they did. They threw away all of this experience and pushed all of that experience out the door. And I'm so sorry.
Thank you. And that's the heartbreaking thing. I realize that people across the country are not going to sympathize with federal employees, but the reality is that there's been this anti-government movement for more than a decade where they're calling us the deep state. They're painting us in a negative light. And, we are patriotic just as much as anyone else. And not everyone was a tree-hugging liberal. I found that out in terms of engaging my former colleagues about donating to my campaign. There are people who hide their conservatism quite well. And so, but that's the nature of when you're working on counterterrorism, as I had done for a decade, you want the most talented people in that office on the other side at the embassy. And whether they're a MAGA Republican or the most liberal Democrat, you want competency and you want institutional knowledge. And it's unfortunate that that's gone away.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that too. Like, you worked in the Office of Countering Violent Extremism, and they decided those roles weren't important. And they decided to get rid of those roles. Like, the riff wasn't like oh, hey, this is about you, right? They were actually reducing the State Department's ability to counter violent extremism at a time when the administration keeps saying that they care about countering terrorism and violent extremism. Is that right?
That's the irony. And that's why I truly, until perhaps the last week or two prior to us being officially riffed last July, I thought there was an opportunity to either get reassigned within the Counterterrorism Bureau. I thought perhaps, okay, they want to get rid of the office, but we'll continue those functions and they'll just move us within the bureau, or perhaps they'll move us to what's called the INL Bureau, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. And they're going to focus on countering violent extremism in Latin America with the drug cartels. But I received outstanding, the top evaluations for the past decade of my service. I have a whole mountain stack of awards. And so I had always thought if you get an award, it's not about gloating about how good you are. It makes it impossible for them to fire you. And they just, instead of identifying the poor performers within the department or encouraging those people who are on the cusp of retirement to retire early, they cut out the heart of the civil service, the policy experts, the people who worked on human rights and other important issues. These were people who were in the middle of their careers. And so, my knowledge, it wasn't just the 3 master's degrees I have, it's the institutional knowledge that I had from my work and also the institutional knowledge that I learned through the people who had mentored me. And that's just wiped away.
I'm sure there's still so much that I don't understand about how the State Department contributes to the counterterrorism mission, but I do remember State Department playing a lot of important roles at the time that the Islamic State was sort of taking off. I still love the online counter-influence effort, the turn away campaigns that were...
Yeah.
Those actually made a difference to a lot of people who were on the fence and sort of flirting with the idea of, is there something to this ideology? And to think that that's not there the next time something like that happens, that kind of bugs me.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, I, as a candidate for Congress, I'm consuming Iranian propaganda and I'm liking and sharing it, not because I'm anti-American, which I'm not, but because it's entertaining. And it's ironic that we're just getting beat at our own game in terms of the Lego videos using
I
AI.
was about to say, I was going to say the Lego videos,
they understood the assignment way better than us. That's all there is to it. We are failing at this game right now. And it's because the people who are running the show have no idea what they're doing anymore. And they've cast out all of the talent.
And I presume they don't have the same clearance process that we have, because those videos, if we were doing it against Iran, would never, ever have been approved, because the second that it landed on the desk or the laptop, the computer of the assistant secretary, they'd be like, absolutely, or the lawyers would kill it. So
it's frustrating to stand by and watch, for sure.
And we've seen, too, attacks happen in the places where we either had programming or were discussing the potential for programming. Like in January of 2025, just before Donald Trump returned to office, we were having conversations in the Counterterrorism Bureau with our embassy in Australia about rising anti-Semitism there, especially amongst the Pakistani diaspora. And lo and behold, about 10, 11 months later, there was the attack on Jews in Australia, the Bondi Beach attack. Perhaps our programming would not have prevented that, but at least we were focused in the right areas. And, with prevention, it's hard to show the results, but it's also the programming that we did. It helped inform law enforcement and others who could have interdicted. So it's unfortunate to see attacks happen in the places where we were laser focused on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Speaking of your work there and how sometimes you don't see what hasn't happened because it was prevented, but we know we were safer because people were out there and were engaging in these dialogues. Now that you're not there, you're running for Congress. Tell us a little bit more about that.
I wanted to continue to serve, and given that the barriers to reentry on the executive branch are quite difficult, I decided to run for Congress. I need a job, and this would be an unusual way to pursue, a job. It's not the traditional way, but it's about advocating for federal employees and just recognizing that if the media is not talking about federal employees, about us losing our jobs, our benefits, some of us losing our homes, then it's going to be tough to pass legislation to reinstate us and compensate people for the enormous losses that they're experiencing. And so I've made a point that reinstating federal employees is not the only issue that I'm advocating for, but it's the most important for me, because within our district in Northern Virginia, we went from the lowest unemployment rate before Trump returned to the highest in the country. And just the saturation of unemployed, highly skilled, highly educated individuals. It's really hard for people around me who have advanced degrees, have a decade plus government experience to find jobs that will pay the bills. And so someone could say, well, go to get a job at Home Depot. You're still not paying your mortgage on a salary, the hourly wage that Home Depot is paying. And so we're in a desperate situation. And so me talking to you, me giving interviews to the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, their audience is hearing from someone who is directly impacted by these cuts. And also, if they think that I'm smart and articulate, that goes against the Doge narrative that these were all unqualified bureaucratic hacks, which I believe I'm not.
No,
No.
absolutely not. You are absolutely not. And that is something that has been across the board from what we've seen. The people that were cut, the people that felt they had to leave were all extremely well educated in very experience heavy roles. Philip has put together this OPM data project where he went through and just across the board, what was it? It was approximately like 15 years of federal service. And the small amount of people that have come in to fill those roles, it's not been a lot, but 1 or 2 years of experience. They're all much younger. You see that brain drain. You see, we don't have that expertise anymore. And how is that going to impact us moving forward and going into the future?
Yeah, and countering violent extremism, it's so nuanced that why does one person radicalize? And I give the example, I did a column after I was separated from service. In Belgium in 2016, there was this major terrorist attack by the Islamic State. And one of the suicide bombers, his brother, a month later, 2 months later, competed in the Olympics for Belgium. And so you have an example of two brothers, one that radicalized, became a terrorist, and one who became a national hero. And so what happened with the brother, the terrorist brother? How did he fall through the cracks and radicalize? And how did the other not? The same family, same economic background, same neighborhood, just growing up and having different friends or having a different perspective or a different personality really matters. And so even if you can't find the needle in the haystack, you could engage the community where which is the proverbial haystack, and ensure that teachers, parents, law enforcement officials are all talking to each other. And then what we did see, parents would call or go to the police station and say, my son, I have some concerns. How can we get him some help? Because in the United States, if your child is radicalizing, you call the local FBI office and they are possibly going to be breaking down your door and hauling your son away because they supported a designated terrorist organization. He or she could be sentenced to 20 plus years versus getting the counseling to lead a productive life. And so there were so many benefits to the work that we did. And so I just want to continue to highlight that. And it's not trying to rebuild, go back in the past, but to say that this work mattered and it's worth having a discussion in a different administration or even now about how we can support something that's going to help promote national security.
Yeah. So, Jill, you mentioned the numbers. I pulled it up here, and this is sort of my processing of OPM's data, so it might not line up perfectly, but the State Department lost almost 4,000 people between January 2025 and January 2026. The average length of service was over 15 years, and the median was just about 12. But then on the hiring side, they only hired 1,099 during that time frame. And actually, over a third of those were in January of 2025, which means that was probably before the hiring stopped for 2025. And those people may not be there anymore either because they were probably on probation and targeted for removal too. The people they brought in had roughly 5 years of previous government service. They skewed on the young end. There's a huge sort of replacement of talent and experience with new people who, it's great that young people are getting into government, but they're not going to have that leadership there anymore.
Oh, and what they're doing right now, a couple things. One, they're hiring contractors, which those people may not have that experience. And two, they have to pay them more because they're not just paying the salary, but they have to pay a contracting company to manage that contract. They're paying more and getting less. And then secondly, they're creating barriers for people like myself and the other 1,107 civil servants who were separated on September 9th. So I'll explain a little, but we got the RIF notice on July 11th. We were given 60 days of administrative leave, and then we were separated on September 9th. But we have been unable to apply to any openings at the State Department because everything that's been posted on USA Jobs is internal applicants only. And so it's our belief that they're having this short hiring window for internal applicants. And if they don't get the suitable applicants there for those positions, they get to hire anyone they want, which are their buddies or whatever. And so it's unfortunate that the place that many of us would want to return the service, not because we are for or against Donald Trump or Republican principles, but because we want to serve. And it's just that dedication to public service that we believe that we need experts, because if we're not working there, mistakes will be made. And we've seen in the case of terrorism, the biggest, most impactful attacks that have happened in the last 25 years were successful on the terrorist side because of a failure of imagination. 9/11, who would have imagined that terrorists would hijack planes and use them as suicide weapons? The Paris attacks in November 2016, we thought Islamic State, they were only focused on Syria and Iraq. We didn't know that the people who were radicalizing within that organization were going to attack in their home countries. And then October 7th, there were members of the Israeli military intelligence who had seen Hamas training on the other side of the wall. And there were people who just didn't pay attention, who didn't connect the dots. And so my point is, without those experts who have that experience and can anticipate what's going to happen, bad things could potentially happen. And I don't want them to happen. But, with the World Cup coming up, with America 250 coming up, we're dangerously unprepared for these threats.
Yeah. There's so much there. I know we could talk for hours about all of that, but I want to get back to your campaign with your running for this office. You're up against some big donor people who got lots of money and lots of experience in politics. So how are you managing working in this campaign space we're regular people. We don't have millions upon millions of dollars at our disposal. How are you doing this?
If I had a time machine, I would go back and make more friends with wealthy people. That probably, since I come from a working class background, would have been hard, but fundraising, the logistics side, building up an organization, it's not easy. And so that the odds are stacked against a first-time candidate, especially one who's not connected to wealthy individuals. And a lot of my network are people who were also RIFed, who took the fork. And people who are still employed are afraid. The Hatch Act allows you to make donations to political campaigns, even though it's legal. They've seen that any suspicion of not supporting the Trump administration could be grounds for dismissal. And so it's been way more difficult than in ordinary circumstances running for office. That being said, I'm running to advocate for federal employees to be the face of, what we're going through. Since I announced back in October, I've had the media exposure that's allowed me to push back against this deep state narrative. And no matter what the outcome of the election, I want this to be a win-win scenario where people understand the plight of federal employees better and understand the importance of having advocates in Congress. But also, it's, when I say educational for me and other federal employees, for us to understand how the sausage is made, because the reality is, if you're not making large donations to candidates, they often don't listen to you. So how do we get the ears of members of Congress? And one of the best ways, at least for me, has been actually running a primary challenge against a very prominent, wealthy Democratic incumbent.
Yeah, and you're absolutely out there and being seen and being heard. We were talking right before this about you're going to be on the Daily Show, and you have been on so many podcasts, so many shows, so many interviews, really just getting that narrative out there. But tell us a little bit about the different media experiences you've had.
I'm an introvert and I have social anxiety. So it's really learning by doing. And I started recording videos for TikTok back in June of last year. And my first videos were horrible. And people still comment on oh, you should do this or that. And I try to be as natural as I can. In politics, there's a hunger, a thirst for authentic candidates. I'm doing my best to be myself, but also the reality is when these videos, these podcasts come out, people will make comments. I try to ignore them, except when they're making accurate criticisms like, well, you could take it how you want to, but someone's like, oh, you should dress better in your videos. It's like, well, I'm trying to look like a working class person, so I'm wearing like my hoodie and all. And it's like, okay, I get it. I'm putting on a shirt. I'm trying to look somewhat presentable, but Daily Show was a completely different level where they're using sarcasm. It's not a live interview. You'll probably see about 90 seconds of me talking, but it took an hour and we did multiple takes and just trying to interject comedy. I let them do the jokes for the most part, but also there was a part where my eyes kind of glazed because when I'm talking about my own personal experience, my coworkers, I get emotional. And no matter how many times I talk about this, I'm not detached from it. And it's like, I'm thinking to myself as I'm saying this, you cannot be the first person to cry on The Daily Show because they'll make that into, they'll play some sad music or something, or Desi Lydic, the correspondent who's interviewing me, might offer me a tissue. And it's like, I don't want to have that Howard Dean moment where you're trying to do good and instead it's the hee-haw kind of, that primal scream or whatever that goes viral. And so I'm doing all of this, as I said before, because we need our stories told. And, I don't know how they'll edit the video, but hopefully I think it'll paint us in a good light. We're human beings. And I think that that's the thing that I was a GS-14 at the State Department. I wasn't in the upper crust of I didn't have an Ivy League degree, not politically connected. And you see me on The Daily Show, on NPR, on MS Now, and this is a journey for me. And so I'm hoping that it ends well in terms of, a career that allows me to take care of my two young kids. But it's not like I was some golden child at the State Department. I was successful at what I did, but I just want people to know that there's so many other super talented, patriotic people who can do great things for our government and will be doing great things in the private sector. But just kicking us to the curb without even, just based on the location of our desk, it's immoral and I believe it's illegal.
Yeah, and we don't live in Virginia anymore, but we really want to see some of the former feds like you get into office and really be able to advocate like you're describing. As much as we talk about the need to rebuild in the future without people like you being part of that process, it's going to be that much harder. So we're rooting for you.
I appreciate it. And I'll give you a scenario where, regardless of the outcome of my race, whether it's a Democrat or a different type of Republican who's in the White House on January 20th, 2029, and they want to rebuild the federal government, I want to ensure that there are people like me who are part of the conversation about how we rebuild the State Department, potentially resurrecting USAID, and do it in a way that serves justice to the people who are let go. My concern is that if the State Department, those 4,000 people, the jobs that were lost, if they say they're going to bring back 4,000 jobs, but the people who lost those jobs, who want to return, who are qualified, if they're at the back of the line or if they're lost in the whole chaos of rehiring people, that's wrong. And so I want to make sure that those people who had to dip in their savings are filing for bankruptcy, that those wages, those benefits, the contributions to the retirement are replaced. And so, for me, it's not about personal glory. And if I'm elected, it's not much of a pay raise being a member of Congress. And that's the sad kind of, you think oh, I'm going to be in a total different tax bracket or whatever. But the practical side of me is thinking okay, if I talk about this controversial issue, is it going to lead to death threats? I could say I'm not worried about that personally, but I have two young kids, and so I am worried about it. I'm trying to ensure that this process of running for office does not impact the well-being of my family, our sanity, but also recognizing that I'm going through a lot of different emotions. And, I started taking anti-anxiety medication. I've never done that before because we're all going through a lot of mental challenges, emotional challenges. And I want to make sure that I'm as whole of a person as possible. And there was a point where there was a researcher who was interviewing fired feds. And I said, I can't talk to you right now because going through the whole process of how I got fired, those emotions, it just was, leaving some damage. For every minute I would talk about it, it would take me several hours to just get back in a better mood. But we see this with a lot of, my coworkers. They're depressed, they're questioning, why this happened to them, and it's hard to explain. But my point is just making sure that I am as even keeled, if you will, as possible. But then I think it's okay to say, like, yeah, today's not a good day for me, or sometimes there are good opportunities to fundraise and I'll have to decline that or not go to it because it's like I just need some space. So I'm both a candidate and someone who has a lot of emotional baggage from everything that's happened.
Well, you're human. And
Yeah.
I had a supervisor that she would tell me, like, when everything was coming down and people were pushing and asking and wanting so much. And she would say her child had said one time to her when she had so much to do, she was like, Mom, I can't. I'm just a human. That's so from the mouths of babes. We're just human. We take so much. We are all very resilient, but it's a lot. And retelling the story is difficult. Philip and I have both been through like retelling of the story, and for me, like it impacts for like a week. I'm out. Like it's so emotional. It's heartbreaking, and it's like reopening that wound, and there's still healing that has to be done there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's when I got riffed last July, I was worried about telling my son that I got fired, my 7-year-old son. He really likes watching videos on YouTube. And so when I was riffed, I was part of the so-called clap out. And I decided to print out a sign at Staples that says Diplomacy Matters, Feds Matter, which is behind me. And as I'm walking out of the State Department, I went through the other end of the building, which had a couple of cameras filming people leaving, but there was no crowd. And I walk out the main entrance, and I didn't realize there were 300, 400, 500 people out there and dozens of TV cameras, and some of them recording or filming, broadcasting live. And so I just held up the sign and I just froze. And I also recognized, okay, they're filming, they need a good shot. But that went viral. It was hard to avoid the news to my son that I got fired because I was sharing it on social media. I thought it was important for people to see this act of what I felt was defiance. And the conversation that I thought was going to be very painful to have with my son about getting fired, it was like, oh, okay. And then we moved on to the next topic and was like, wow, that wasn't as difficult. But typically in our society, when someone gets fired, they don't talk about it with people. It's taboo. And in my case, when I am engaging on the campaign trail, that's the first thing that I often tell people. My name is Michael Duffin and I got fired. Because it's part of my story. I have skin in the game, and it's not just a talking point like save the spotted owls in Oregon or something. I care about those, by the way, but the point is I it's not in my backyard. And so just seeing my neighbors putting up the for sale signs and people who are depressed because they were a valued USAID advisor and they have not had a paycheck in over a year, that inspires me. But also it frustrates me when I see the roadblocks that a candidate like myself I experience because I don't have the access to capital that the incumbent has. I'm not the Gen Z candidate with no kids who can go to all the happy hour bars or networking. I drop off, I pick up my kids every day. I need to make sure over the weekends that they're attended, and that's the point that I'm stressing. That I had a conversation with a member of Congress before I ran, and he said that there are two things you need to make sure don't happen. One, don't go bankrupt. And number two, make sure your family, your wife, doesn't divorce you at the end of this process. Whatever the outcome of the election, I'm raising funding. I'm not spending my own money. And secondly, I'm making sure that the mental health of my family, it's intact, because for me to win at all costs is not worth it.
I think you're showing your son a very good example of being able to take such a negative thing and turn it into something positive and show, like, look, just because I was knocked down does not mean that I'm staying down. And I think that is such a great example for your children.
And now you can watch Dad on YouTube.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every 7-year-old's dream.
So when we turn on web TV on the YouTube app, there's the kids icon or avatar for kids YouTube, and then there's my campaign avatar. And just the reaction that my older son has when he sees like my campaign portrait. He doesn't mock me. He's not, at that age where he's mocking. His reaction says a lot. And so I try not to take myself seriously, and we'll see how the Daily Show comes out. But I think everything that I'm doing, it's really trying to, when I say memorialize this moment in time, because the photos that I took, the emails, a lot of stuff will get lost. But when my kids, when they're older, they could look up what their dad did. And a year ago, I went to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC. I had been to Auschwitz and I had been to Holocaust sites, memorial sites across Europe. And this is the first time I went to that museum. And a lot of the things that they have up there, the displays, there were parallels to what's happening today, enemies of the state. But there was this sign that they had. It says, "What you do matters." And, it's applying to countering anti-Semitism and hate. But also it said to me, what I'm doing, whether I get 5 people voting for me, 5,000 or 50,000, it's being noticed by people. The message that I have on the campaign trail isn't that I'm the smartest, I'm the most articulate, I'm not like the next Obama. I'm this person who was targeted by the richest man in the world, and my colleagues were targeted by the richest man in the world. And I didn't run away. I'm trying to fight back. And I think that's an important message, why it's important to, whether it's running for office or showing up at a protest, that we do our part to safeguard our democracy.
Absolutely. All right, Michael. So the last question, and I feel like you've already kind of answered this, but we'll go ahead with, what would it take for you to go back? I think they would just have to let you go back and you would go.
Yeah, it's something that during the first Trump administration, I had the realization that anything I did really well was not going to help Donald Trump get reelected. And there's nothing I could do as a so-called deep state operative that would prevent him from getting reelected. And so my point is that what we do at the State Department or DHS or the FBI, it's critical for the people who are impacted by our programs. But on the larger political scale, it's not about partisanship. It's important that we have talented, dedicated people who are there. And if I were to go back to public service as a civil servant, it's not about me agreeing or disagreeing with Donald Trump or Joe Biden or anyone. It's about serving the American people. And so I want to be an example for other people, kids who are studying in high school and college, to aspire to work for the government. Because if we don't have idealistic, patriotic people serving in these roles, literally we're going to see the consequences when the administration changes over, and the cupboard is bare in terms of both our national security and the other functions of the government. It's important to have people like us in place.
Absolutely agree there. All right. Well, Michael, we're at the end. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
My website's duffinforva.com. And so if you're watching, whether it's volunteering or just liking, sharing my content on social media, or if you have the ability to contribute, this is about advocating for federal employees. We need a voice, need a seat at the table. And I hope to be on this campaign, share my knowledge, use my knowledge to advocate for federal employees, because without paid lobbyists, without the PACs that really make the politicians listen, we need a voice.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And thank you for speaking up for all of us. And we wish you all the best in this campaign. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for forking off with us.
My pleasure.
Well, that was really great. I really liked talking with Michael and hearing everything that he had to say. We've talked about this a lot, Philip. People are waiting for someone to save them. And Michael said, I'm not going to wait. I'm going to get out there and I'm going to try and I'm going to do what I can. And even if I don't win, I'm going to try and make a difference, and I'm going to try and make these connections so that we can make a difference. I mean, he knows he's up against a Goliath, but I really admire his determination, and I hope the best for him in this.
Yeah, it's a system that's not designed for people like us.
No. I mean, it's like when you ask, like, what would you do? And he was like, I would have made friends with more rich people. I mean, and that's really sad to say.
It is.
But that's where the decisions are being made. And breaking through as the common man is really difficult. But I really admire what he's doing and bringing that message that he had when he left the State Department of diplomacy matters and feds matter. Something that really stuck with me with talking with Michael was when he was talking about going to the Holocaust Museum. He mentioned memorializing the moment, that it really struck him that this is the time that we need to be taking note. We need to be doing something, not just letting things happen, but actually getting in there and doing something and memorializing that so that people can see we've tried and we are trying. And I do believe that we will overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So things that we can do.
Yes. Vote.
Absolutely vote. Going back to the idea of the World Cup, though, and the upcoming events this summer.
Oh, yeah.
It's important that we acknowledge that there's a lot of lack in trust right now, and people might be concerned about going to the authorities if they see something out of place at one of these events, or they have some sort of concern. Even if you're not willing to maybe reach out to a federal tip line, you can call in to a local police department. You can have somebody else do it for you. Find somebody who you trust and get them to make the call. But don't ignore those types of indicators. Like, we know how it feels when something is out of the ordinary. Whether it's a bag that's been left alone, an old beat up car that is just sitting too low unattended. There are so many different things that might catch our eye. And it's important that at these major events like that, we're on the lookout and thinking about these things.
It's the same principle. If you see something that's unusual, do say something. If you don't feel comfortable telling federal authorities, tell local authorities, tell security at the event. They will take care of it. But if you have a gut feeling, go with your gut. It's better to be wrong in this situation than to stay quiet. Be aware there are a lot of big events this summer, and don't be afraid to go and watch these events and go and participate, but be aware of your surroundings and be aware of people around you. And like Michael said, what you do matters. Let's all go out there and do something that matters. Thanks for forking off with us.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Forking Off.
If you're a former Fed with a story to tell, or you're wrestling with your own ethical crossroads, reach out to us at info@forkingoff.com.
Today's episode was created, produced, and edited by Jill and Philip Fields. You can find more information about this episode at forkingoff.com. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, Mastodon, LinkedIn, or wherever you get your podcasts.